I told Brandon that he kind of pulled a John Belushi today, because most people are, have the name of John Smith. So I don't know if you remember in Animal House, when at the fraternity, when John decides to name everybody, you will be Flounder from now on. So for some technical reason, there are a lot of people here, John Smith.
I love it when I join in from the group, from the breakout, and John is talking about Animal House. Like that, I think minimizes this group a little. I don't know.
Exactly. So good to see everybody.
And of course, Ology has renamed himself as John Doe. Nice.
John, there you go. Look at all caps. So he's kind of
like you get high. Like you get high.
I was hoping mine would rename me to John Younger.
Yeah, there you go. We all want
for one day.
Yeah, right? Exactly, for sure.
And the real John Smith, please stand up.
Right.
Do that, Preston. We won't tell him that you did it yourself.
Yeah, I know. Where's
Latino John Smith around here?
Is John Healy here?
John Healy is here.
Oh, there he is. Yeah.
Good stuff.
Yeah. Maybe I'll give everybody an update on kind of what's happened on the book. Look at this, check it out. I mean, it's like the book is in one place, and like, ooh. Yeah, I know, right? And I think I've got it kind of like end of the week. I'm going to have it in a place where I'm going to send it off to it. Our editor is going to go through it once and clean it up, and then we'll turn it into the publisher. So I think we're in a pretty good place, and we're getting there. So anyway, it's been a long journey though. Oh my God. So, yeah, anyway.
Finish lines within reach. Stay positive, stay focused.
Yeah, exactly. Couldn't have done it without John Healy's, great leadership at CTW for sure. It's given me some space to, think about like all this complexity of how you put all these nice things we talk about into a book. So, so appreciate all the effort. I'm gonna hand it over to you, John.
Cool. Well, I'm excited for today to try to open up a broader conversation. So I was talking with Connor Haney at CXC, who's been one of our regular contributors here, and we were talking about standards. And CXC does a lot of work in the compliance area, as do some of the other members in the organization. And so Hannah Young has been commandeered in by Connor to start us out by maybe just looking at some of the compliance end of things. Often we hear a lot of perspective from the platforms of what's going on, but ultimately our goal that we've talked about all along is to get more and more enterprises to feel comfortable engaging with open talent. And enterprises all have to deal with risk in some capacity, one way or another. And so we wanted to just kind of get a sense of what some of those areas are. And then we'll let Hannah go through a couple slides, but then we want to just kind of turn it out to the community as a whole and have a conversation just about standards and what areas we need to have standards in. Begin having the debate. We're not going to finalize anything, but as an objective for this group, we want to get to this stage where we can recognize what some of those standards are and allow organizations to attest that they're going to commit to those standards, and then ultimately fit that into the accreditation process as we work our way through that. So that's kind of the lineup for today and what we want to do. So hopefully people will chime in and we'll make this a robust conversation. So Hannah, I'm going to kind of turn the floor over to you and let us let you set the stage for us.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, John, for that lovely introduction. So hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Young. I'm the Solution Specialist at CXC EMEA. For those of you who may not be too familiar with CXC, we are a global employer of record, agent of record, PEO, GEO, whatever you want to call it. We are basically a global payroll provider for contingent workforce. So you could say we know a thing or two about compliance and the compliance standards that, let's say, platforms or enterprises really should be putting in place when engaging with open talent or gig workers to ensure that they really are law abiding and everything will go smoothly. So I have put together a few slides today. I know the dreaded presentation, but I promise it is short. And honestly, I want to make it really collaborative. So please, if there's any questions, jump right in. If you have any points of information, just interrupt me. I won't be offended. And lastly, I am a work in progress, so I don't claim to know it all. So if I can't answer your question, I'll pick that up offline at a later point. But right now, figuring out how to share my screen, hoping you guys can all see this now. Okay. First off, I guess apologies to Steve Radar and everyone at NASA for this terrible depiction of the black hole. But anyways, this is supposed to represent the massive black hole of compliance within the open talent community and the gig platforms that exist. So what I'm trying to say really is gig platforms are growing at such a fast speed and cropping up everywhere. And it's still kind of not shocking, but interesting that there isn't a standard of compliance around the globe of what these platforms need to be checking when engaging freelancers or open talent or gig workers along the way. So that will lead me on nicely to this slide. So I love this slide. We show it to all of our clients, or new clients that we're bringing on. I don't know why, it really puts the fear of God into them. But really all it's saying is if you don't have certain compliance in place, these are the big risk factors that you're playing with. So that being, you know, if you're not putting intellectual or IP policies in place when you're onboarding a worker, and you're putting your IP at risk. If you're not checking where your worker is based in the world, and you don't know if their contract is in line with local legislations, let's say, you're putting yourself at a huge risk. If you're not putting them through, let's say, a status determination test and you're misclassifying them, that's a whole other ball game, and you could be liable for huge fines and taxes. And of course, if you're not checking for any proof of tax compliance or anything like that, you could be hit with huge tax chain liability. So they're kind of the main huge factors or risks that we always speak through with our clients when they first come on when engaging or looking to engage an IC or a freelancer, let's say. I might just take a breath there to see if anyone has any questions or points of information. If not, that's fine, I'll shoot on, but might just pause for a sec.
Can you talk a little bit about how skills form a part of legal and fiduciary?
So interestingly enough, it doesn't really, in this diagram, what we're really trying to say is skills are really important, but they're not a risk in this sense. What we're trying to say is that the employee, the risk that you're taking on when you're taking on a full-time employee rather than a fixed-term worker is that they may not have the skills that you're looking for. It's taking a long time maybe to train them up, let's say, and that's the risk you're taking on maybe by engaging a full-time worker instead of an IC who could be more skilled. But when you're taking on an IC, you don't know if maybe they fit the right legalities behind that. So that's kind of what we're saying here.
I think what you're saying is that you're encapsulating risk as a commercial risk as opposed to a legal or regulatory risk. So what you're thinking in the particular chart is risk that can be defined as commercial, legal, fiduciary, reputational. Risk has many different dimensions to it. And I think that's what you're trying to say here, right?
That's what I'm trying to say here. You hit it nail on the head, with huge emphasis on those kind of things on the side as well.
If you ask a regular user, they'd actually flip it. They'd say, you know, we can't vet contingent workers or contractors or freelancers as well as we vet employees. So the risk of they're not having the skills is higher, is what you generally hear.
Yeah, that's also a good point to bring into the conversation. Okay, if no one has any other points, I will flick on to, if I can flick on, to kind of the best practices or maybe standard rules that we really think that these platform workers should be, or platforms should be asking their ICs or freelancers to provide at a bare minimum when they're engaging them. So first things first is, does this freelancer have their own company or legal entity? You should really be gathering the documents of that during onboarding. It's surprising that not everyone does, but just as a bare minimum, that's what you should be doing. Second of all, you should really be checking that they have a business bank account within the same country that their business entity is registered in. What you're really trying to avoid here is, that your freelancer isn't trying to launder any money and they don't have a business bank account somewhere off in the Cayman Islands. Naturally, it will lead to a really messy situation for you. Next thing is up, you want to make sure that you have really correct contract for services and appropriate services agreement. Again, this can really come into play if there's any misclassification errors taking place. This is where they'll look at to see if this worker should be engaged as an employee and if the contract has something that mirrors an employee. So you need to really ensuring that your contracts are fit for purpose on the platform. Again, this probably comes into play a lot, especially for me when we're based in EMEA and with IR35 being a huge factor. Constantly checking with the freelancer, one, if they have a status determination that they've outside IR35, but also checking, that they're using their own equipment and that they're, not under the control of the end client. There's mutual obligation between client or platform or client and the freelancer themselves. You're also going to check if they have insurances. Really, really important. You don't want the insurance risk coming back for an enterprise or for a platform as a whole. Again, you're going to have to check, need them to prove that they have tax compliancy or proof of tax compliancy the last 2, 5, or how long they've been in business years, to check that that tax sharing liability doesn't come back and slap the platform or enterprise in the face, or both along the way. The right to work really makes me laugh sometimes. I think it's because it's the most obvious one that you really should be checking as a platform, that of course the freelancer has the correct right to work. But honestly, the amount of times that us as an organization go to engage a freelancer for one of our end clients, and our client is saying, hey, we have a worker based in the US. Can you engage in the US or based in France? And we go to check their documentation, and their business entity is in Ireland, their bank account is set up in Ireland, and their passport is Irish. And we say, hey, well, do you have a work visa here? They say, oh, well, the pandemic came and I thought, hey, I can work from the US for a year. And, it really doesn't work that way. So that was a really interesting one that's happened a lot over the past 2 years. And it seems so basic, but something that platforms really need to be checking as literally a minimum standard when engaging freelancers. Again, as a bare minimum, any money laundering check, that could start at really the bronze stage and working your way up through silver and gold, and asking them to complete, let's say, global sanction check and a 5-year reference check or something like that, just to really hit those high levels of compliance. But at a minimum, really checking and doing an anti-money laundering check as well. And then, of course, for the sake of the enterprise, it's really important that platforms are getting their freelancers to sign NDAs and IP agreements to ensure that the company is really protected and there's confidentiality there as well. So I might stop here for a second. The rest of my slides really are to go through maybe some cases that have happened in the UK. I'm aware that the target audience here is probably predominantly US, just where large companies like Uber have kind of been caught out with misclassification of their workers and by not vetting them correctly when onboarding. But I'll stop here and see if anyone has any kind of points to add or open up the conversation a little bit more.
Yeah, Hannah, this is really great. I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit about the responsibilities between where they fall, the platform that these workers are on versus the client, like in exposure. Are there particular ones that are fuzzy or,
So, yeah, I think there is a lot of gray areas, and it really does come down to, when they're being audited, what actually happens in court and where that liability stands and who the contract lays with. Let's say you're through a platform, the end contract actually is with the platform and they're kind of leasing you out to the end client. At the end of the day, the platform is going to be held responsible for that. If you're just providing the service of the worker and the end contract is with the client, they're going to be held responsible for that. So it really does depend on the dynamic that's involved.
So Balaji, you raise a question in the chat that I think is a fun one to maybe get us into some dialogue as a group of how often are employers or EORs or the intermediaries sued for missing any of these. And I think that starts to get into a question. You commented earlier too, Balaji, that the typical business user really doesn't care about that. Yet when a platform is trying to contract into a client organization, or they're trying to be used by an end user, suddenly the corporate immune system kicks into gear and says, oh, wait a minute, you need to tick all these boxes. And so that's one of the pieces for the standards, is to figure out what is important and what needs to be put in place, and where is there excess that's being asked for. And I think that's part of the conversation that we want to have. So that I'd like to maybe open it up to some different people to explore. If you start thinking, and I'll pick 3 specific areas: identity, the identity of the worker, who's doing that work. Payment is another one that's an easy one to look at. Hannah, you referenced some elements of making sure someone's paid properly and you're not getting any accusations of money laundering tied into it. But billing is another, where you have legal compliance issues that are in place. And I'm curious if there are any of the enterprise buyers. So instead of the platform side, anyone on the buy side, maybe even Preston from Coke, as you look at compliance, like what has stood out as kind of those minimum thresholds for you as you've been bringing in gig talent? Like, what do we have to have? And where do you think maybe we're going too far?
I think at a very basic level, and I like to categorize things in terms of what's the nature of the engagement. So is somebody coming onto my site? Are they doing work remotely for me? Could it be like an open innovation type agreement? You know, what may it be? And that really determines what we're looking at. But at a very basic level, we're always looking, or we're asking our platform to manage the tax piece. But I think one of the thing that always keeps me up at night is, can we even be doing work with this individual? So from a sanctions perspective, you know, is this an individual we can do trade with? Things like that. Probably less concerned about insurance generally. And then there's all the, all the different types of co-employment standards, but those tend to vary a lot just depending on the nature of work, how long we're going to be doing that work, where are they, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, just to add to that, and speaking as a platform, I'm Sam at Worksome. This is my first time here, so hello everybody. I think, really you've got to look at which platform we're talking about here. There's lots of platforms out there. It's actually frustrating. I find it frustrating. I think I was chatting to Morton, our CEO, earlier about how Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash and companies like that get described as platforms because, they're businesses that run platforms that manage gig workers, and they have, just to bring it back to kind of antitrust, they have antitrust issues. There's no one's going to argue that, right? But when you talk about platforms, you've really got to look at what the platform's there to do. Are the platforms in place to manage compliance? I would say most marketplaces aren't. They're there to find talent. And then you have all the problems of compliance that happen after that they sometimes try and shoehorn into them, right? So, I think there's got to be a kind of common sense approach to how you tackle things like, all these things listed here, Hannah, bank account, address, entities, right to work, totally valid for any enterprise that's hiring any level of talent. I think there's got to be a kind of common, some of the clients we have that are large enterprises, they have a common sense approach to it as to what's the level of engagement that we're really doing with this worker and how are we engaging with them. If it's such a small engagement and the actual risk is so, it's perceived risk more than anything, then as a platform, perhaps we can have a responsibility to indemnify the client. Well, it's a really simple conversation to have, right?
Yeah, and Sam, I think that's an important part, especially given Preston's comments. Our platform, with Parker Dewey, our platform, the freelancers who are all college students are actually employees or contractors of Parker Dewey itself. And our clients, whether it's, again, Pepsi or Microsoft or whomever, are actually engaging Parker Dewey LLC to do the work. And the student is a 1099 or employee. So we're essentially taking all of that on. And as the general counsel of one of the big banks said, from their perspective, it's the same as if they went to Kinko's, because it's sort of mitigated all of that risk completely.
Absolutely. You should be utilizing platforms to solve problems that you need solving, right? It's not like a managed service where you set something up on day one, deploy it, and 12 months later, you realize that actually lots of different things happen at different times and what you originally set up aren't fit for purpose anymore, right? Case by case, you should be able to engage with workers. I think classification in the US and the UK is a perfect example of that. Who are you engaging? What flow do they need to be going through in order for them to be compliant? And is it relevant? If it's not relevant, you know, there's a risk, yes, but let's just indemnify it and get on with it, because it's going to slow the project down. If you're engaging with a long-term inside IR35 or W2 worker, let's do that properly. Let's run through checks and balances as appropriate, you know, and there has to be, someone's commented here, you know, common sense compliance live in different areas of the metaverse. They actually, you know, it takes quite a pragmatic procurement lead or category manager or whoever it makes that decision to make that decision. And that's kind of where we're at the moment.
And I think, you know, there are two ways to think about it, right? I feel like a lot of, there is no disagreement that you need all of these. The big issue that I have constantly is these checks shouldn't, majority of these checks shouldn't happen at the transaction level. It should happen at the entry to the platform level. Like, you're not checking the driver's background check when you order the ride. You do that when they enter the platform. I feel like that, you know, the split between when this happens, it feels like a lot of it tends to happen at the transaction level, which expands it. And these answers don't change per transaction, you know, and it is the ability of the marketplace or the platform in some way to say, you know, 8 of these checks are already done. The worker classification is transaction specific. So we have to do that at the transaction. But it feels like it's a little lopsided as to when this actually happens.
Well, and I think that the thing I heard too, Balaji, was that it's the most important probably is that there are both kinds of platforms. There are marketplaces that feel like all they're doing is like a dating service and matching you up. And then there's companies that you actually have a contract with to go get you the right talent, and you're relying on them to actually handle all these compliance. That's how we do it. We talk about it as we are procuring goods and services from, you know, freelancer or whatever the company is, and that then their subcontracting model, their workforce model is to go and run a challenge or go get a freelancer or use their crowd however they're going to, but that's their back end model. And therefore, I know contractually, we have a contract with those entities and we are relying on it. But I think what Sam's bringing up is very important, which is you got to be careful as you go out there to make sure you know which of those two types you have, because if you think you can do the same stuff on just a matching platform, you may have some bad experiences.
Well, isn't Steve? Isn't that in itself a little bit too binary?
No, yeah, I don't disagree. Like there's levels of compliance, but from a fundamental model standpoint, we have a contract with a company that's the platform.
I think the barriers are there's several different barriers. One is the function of a platform is simply as a connection mechanism, as opposed to being responsible for the outcome and deliverables, so they can be employees. And then another one, which I think is an interesting one, is this idea of background check portability. You know, in the past, there was the logic is pretty sound that if somebody did work for X, Y, and Z a year ago, or did work for a competitor, you can pretty much assume that they have passed the necessary background checks. This was a real issue at the beginning of COVID, where people struggled mightily to get background checks verified. People couldn't hire people because the background checks couldn't just get done. So I think part of the standardization would be great. I mean, it would be transformative if we could agree on some sort of standard that allowed for background check portability at the individual level as opposed to the engagement level. So for example, company X, company Y, company Z would agree that this particular background check is sufficient to engage that person. And that would really speed up the hiring process and remove a lot of non-value business processes. Just something that is incredibly inefficient.
One last thing, and I promise I'll shut my mouth, is we also need to remember that there are two types of users of the gig economy. There's one type that's ultimately trying to use it, and I'm talking on the corporate side, to get around employment law. Like, let's be honest about it. There are definitely those organizations that are trying to thread the needle to get around employment law. There's others that see the real inherent benefits of leveraging freelancers as part of an overall corporate strategy. I think when we consider whatever regulations, processes, et cetera, we need to do so that we are focused on that second bundle. Because that first group, the ones trying to sneak around employment law and the like, it just opens up other cans of worms. And again, sorry for bringing that up, but I think it's important.
Jeff, a question on that is that, do you feel that that's more the exception than the rule? Because a lot of, I mean, I think with smaller to medium businesses, they maybe are trying to do that to get around employment law. I think that at the enterprise level, I think it's the path of least resistance in a lot of ways.
Well, the reason I'm not sure it matters, but I think most of the regulation we see today is the result of people trying to get around employment law. Like when we think about the use of your own device, like that's one of those things that if people weren't trying to be sneaky around employment law, is sort of an unnecessary piece of regulate. Like I'm not sure of the answer, but I think it's worth considering because, again, from a purely in the US tax regulatory perspective, that's what it's all tied to. That's all the government cares around.
Yeah.
Link, I've seen your hand up for a bit. Do you have something you want to add in?
Yeah, thank you. I come at it from a worker standpoint of going, through the all of the stuff that I hear in conversations is that most of what's been happening with the platforms overall and the tax liabilities, that most of the entrepreneurs have experience with this already. And I think of it from a point of advocacy coming from CTW wanting to reach, 1 billion people by 2025. So I think about through the pandemic and the Great Resignation, all the new entrepreneurs that are coming on board that don't have a back office, that don't have a secretary, are learning all these tools for the first time and wanting to make their break in an industry that they can see that they're going to make $20 more an hour or $60 more an hour if they take this contract that's in another country. So I think about all the tax liabilities that new entrepreneurs are not aware of and all the stuff that's coming down the chute so quickly is how is this message going to be spread across to inform the worker? If there has to be some set of standards that come into play where platforms are willing to agree on a set of standards that work for a little bit of everyone so that entrepreneurs can get familiar with a standard process instead of going to this platform and I got to send it through, this set of securities and I got to wait this much amount of time for payment. And then I'm going to be liable for this tax break on this one or this tax liability on this one. And then I take a gig over here for a few $1,000s. And now I got stuff on that and managing all of that, not every entrepreneur has the ability and capability of hiring a tax professional that has international law experience. So what is this going to look like for the worker as we start to partner with one another to build our company?
So I totally agree with everything you just said. You've got a whole generation of people now who are potentially going into careers as a freelancer as their first step into work life. One day they are being classified as an IC, or they're not being classified at all because they're working for a studio in Brooklyn. The next day they're walking into a global enterprise with layer upon layer upon layer of bureaucracy, and they don't get started for 3 weeks. There's too much of a divide between that experience as a worker, and there's no understanding from our view anyway. We're working with tens of thousands of workers. You get every question under the sun every single day because no one knows what the score is. It's bonkers. But I haven't met a single enterprise, global enterprise, that doesn't put tax and legal paramount when they're looking at how they handle these workers.
Yeah, and I think that is the reason, the question of how often do these get sued? And again, Sam, to your point about just indemnify them, your comfort in doing that is based on some data in terms of how often do companies get sued? Like where we have employers of record, to the wazoo that we pay, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. I'm not sure. I mean, if I look them up to see how many times they've been sued in the last 10 years, it's not that often. We're literally paying them all of these dollars for that checklist of 10 to 25 list items That doesn't seem to happen often enough, but the fear that is sold to us constantly that, all of these like background checks, again, in the pandemic, the number of times that we waive background checks, everybody waived background checks, and we track data. How many times did anything go wrong? The data was identical pre-background checks and post-background checks. We have, when we have a business model that is driven on compliance, there's a fear that is sold that you have to constantly do it, otherwise something bad is going to happen. I think, and that creates this notion of huge compliance concerns that mess up the experience for the workers, that mess up the experience for the business users. There has to be and again, my biggest concern with the word standard is it's all the time you take the highest worst case scenario and you create a compliance standard around that makes the experience really bad for the 99% of the cases. You always use the lowest common denominator when you come up with a compliance standard. And that is my biggest concern.
I'm with you 100% there. And I think that's, Steve, you raised the question of we do our contracting, we get all this done. I think for the standards, when I think of this, it's about how can we make that contracting process easier for you? Because once the contract's in place, it's very easy for you to engage with whoever that partner is that's there. But the process of getting through the contract with your organization or any large enterprise is typically about 30 days for a supplier. And that's an unacceptable standard if we're trying to create a new one.
It's like a 9-month process, just to be clear.
Okay.
Contracting with the U.S. government is just really hard. But yes.
Julie, do you had a question?
Yeah, I'm looking from the other side. So I'm not a freelancer. I'm on the enterprise side. And of course, I'm more interested in using the platform as a full service. So I would also agree on that's not binary, Sam, because if I want to have a freelancer, then of course I want a platform who does the matchmaking and takes the effort from me to do all these checks. And as you said, I don't need necessarily background checks. I need, as Balaji mentioned, I need the right skill set. And then some of the jobs I could give you and say, we don't need background checks. So all this, even in Europe, in our company in Germany, we have background checks only if you are in a banking business, and I'm not. Or we have people who have then certain admin rights on our systems who would undergo a background check. So then the heavy weight that you mentioned, Balaji, would be unnecessary overcomplicating that search for me. And I understand standards are nice, but of course you can get lost in the standards. That's the one. And 30 days is quite quick, by the way. In our company, it takes longer to get a freelancer, up and running. 2 months, I would say. That's it. So you are already there quite fast, what I've heard. So,
Andy,
it's nice to be back. By the way, I've spent a year missing you guys. So hello everyone again. It's sort of an observation, and just in a parallel industry, when we take flights to places, we all go merrily through the gates and we show them what's in our suitcase and all that kind of stuff. And I'm happy if somebody can tell me I'm wrong, but as far as I know, you have to do that every single time. There's no way of having a special passport that says, no, look, I'm not the terrorist. I'm okay. Don't worry about checking me. Just let me sail through. There probably is, right, for diplomats and whatever, but not for us ordinary folk. So I just wonder if it would be a lovely thing to solve, but maybe it's more about making the experience quicker and easier rather than having a permanent passport or something that's checked less frequently than every time we get a new gig.
Yeah,
my 2 pennies worth.
No, I love that analogy. That's EasyJet versus the Eurostar, basically, isn't it? You got to do the checks. It's how you do it.
So I'm seeing the reference of TSA pre-check for contractors is what we need. And wouldn't that be fun if we could establish that you were able to understand that these platforms or the workers coming from these environments have been pre-vetted, pre-checked in some way that enables you to bring people on quicker to kind of work your way through that. Albert?
Yeah, I've been uncharacteristically quiet because I'm really interested in listening to what everybody has to say. But I think that one of the things that's been brought up, and that was a really good example of it is this idea of passport. So I think that one thing that hasn't been explicitly mentioned by anyone is the segmentation of the issue of standardization. We've been talking about it as quite a homogenous issue, but it strikes me that there are like 3 issues on one side, which is on a policy basis. We're talking about things like IR35, which is effectively how do we protect employment law and the terms in which people engage and try and stop people effectively avoiding tax. 2 is the certifications of an individual, the idea of a passport, some kind of standardization of the presentation of you as a worker. And then 3 is like client protection, which is things like intellectual property and the ways that we engage and NDA stuff, which is about the actual transactional interaction of a client and an individual. And then secondarily, we have domestic and international. And they also strike me as completely different segments of problems. Those 3 things are different on an international transaction to what they are on a domestic transaction. And I actually think if you take the analogy of an airport, you have multiple parties being involved. You have a set of policies which have to be followed. You have a commercial interest in a transaction that's being kept by the airport or the airline. And then you have the representation of the individual via the passport. And it strikes me that if we try and bundle these 3 things and then add on international transactions as well, within any one platform, it's never going to be possible. And it's inevitably going to be people like Worksum who make it really fucking easy for, really easy for the client to interact with an individual and handle those transactional issues, and the responsibility of somebody else to standardize the representation of the individual within that transaction, and the responsibility of all of us to create better policy understandings and cultural understandings of how to make interactions more interesting to try and remove issues like equipment usage with IR35.
Excellent. Torsten.
Hi, everyone. First time here, so apologies for my German accent and not being completely up to speed yet. But what I don't like about the airport analogy is obviously, yes, it's a hassle, but it's fast. Getting a freelance on board and doing all those checks is not fast, as we have established already. So if we have the wonderful platform, let's call out Worksum or someone else that has solved that issue around compliance checks, at least for some parts of the world, how hard is it to potentially offer that as a shared service for other platforms, or rank platforms, because we call everything a platform nowadays. But if we actually have different categories of platforms and say, here's a wonderful skill match board, here's I manage your remote workforce platform, or there's something else, and we have in G2 or Capterra these items listed as a feature. So caveat emptor, if you use this platform and they don't do compliance checks, don't be annoyed, just be annoyed to yourself, because you could have selected the better platform for that. But for me, these are those 2 angles that we should either classify the platforms further, or potentially saying, rather than establishing a standard, let's use some of the best practices, make it usable for others, and leverage it from there and help everyone.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement. I mean, the fundamental thing is, like you said, the data's there, right? Frustratingly, the data is sometimes in City Hall in a random town in the middle of nowhere in America, right? Where that check has to be physically done sometimes. If you look at what's been going on in banking with open banking and how banks now share information, if you look at our engineering team are open source. So they make features, they think they're pretty cool, they share them with other developers, which other companies end up using. It's really cool. Why isn't that being, maybe that's some way, maybe that's an angle that we should be looking at the standard as more of data sharing than anything else, right?
Yeah, and I think, Sam, the one thing that is why can't somebody monetize all of this compliance friction? Like to say, I will, if you want to get this process done within 1 day, pay me 10% of the cost. If you want to get this done in 5 days, pay me 5%. If you want to get this done in 1 month, pay me 1% of the cost. There's just no gradation to friction exists everywhere. It is the monetization of that friction and somebody owning that friction and converting that into an opportunity is what we see missing, versus what we see a lot is compliance, flags waving that, yes, you should do all of these. It'll take a long time. You still have to pay us for it. And then the experience is still bad for everybody. That's where the issue is. Companies like the reason why a TalkTal or somebody else can charge an insane amount of money is because they're like, we absorb all of that friction of vetting. We'll give you 1 or 2 candidates. They always work, and pay us a really 50% markup for it. And most companies say yes. Monetize that friction. We'll pay you for it when it's possible. When it's not urgent, we'll deal with the friction. Like,
yeah, ironically, it's a business like Lyft or Uber that would probably take you up on that offer,
exactly.
Balaji.
Yeah, and it's again, even if you talk about banks, a lot of times when you run a credit card, there are times
it's
when
amazing.
the banks actually absorb it.
This dog used to bark at my dog, so it must be a different dog. Because I don't know.
Sorry, if there's a way to mute the
It's the same one.
John Smith dog person.
If we mute all of the
There's
John Smiths, we got
a
a
dog
problem.
barking somewhere.
There are companies like, let's say, for example, when I send out money to my mom in India, the transaction goes through, and then in case there's an issue with the transaction, I get to know later. So it's almost as though they're like, in the fees that you're covering, we're assuming that this is a legit transaction. We're assuming that this contractor is legit or this freelancer is legit. It's all compliant. We're going to let the work happen first. The assumption is this is legit. Let's keep going. Versus in freelancing, for some reason, and contracting for some reason, is every transaction is not legit. Every transaction is fake. Let's run all the compliance checks each time. And then, let's impose that friction on 95% when you're maybe catching 0.1%. We have to change that notion, and we're selling that to companies saying it's very risky to do contracting, and then like, oh, they're freaking out and then adding their own compliance processes. We have to change this notion of how risky this thing is.
I agree, Balaji. So from what I'm hearing here is a discussion about risk and informed risk taking, and maybe inverting the way that we think about that risk. So assume it's low until it's proven high. The other analogy that springs to my mind is around insurance policies. So I can go on to a compare the market type comparison website. I can look at all of the insurance policies, and they're ranked by price. But the other piece of information that is on there is the de facto rating. I don't know if de facto is a thing that translates into the US, but it's effectively your insurance provider has 1 star, 2 stars, 3 stars, 4 stars, 5 stars. 1 star you wouldn't go with. They're usually very cheap, but you're never going to get a payout if you crash your car. So you'll look at the 4 and 5 star and you'll think, well, is it worth paying 30% more for a 5 star over a 4 star? Well, yeah, it kind of is. And there'll be cases where it is, and there'll be cases where it isn't. And it's almost having, instead of thinking about standards, having an assessment framework that you can evaluate platforms / freelancers, however it gets implemented, and make your own informed risk-based decision. Because even enterprises, we can't talk about enterprises as though they are a homogeneous mass. Every enterprise has its own way of approaching risk assessment and their own risk appetite. So we sort of need to factor that into the way we're thinking and talking about this.
Jim, you've had your hand up for a bit.
A quick one. So I think this discussion's been really interesting, but as somebody who was kind of on the front end of worldwide contracts with big IT companies in the outsourcing world when it started, let's not forget about latent legal risk. Somebody suing you 2 years, we could solve all the problems in the world today, but if some law group comes out and says, hey, there's an experience, we're going to go after the deep pockets of your clients, or who we're going to go after on this group, somehow that needs to be part of this conversation. So I might suggest that it might be interesting to bring in some big law firms to talk about this issue, because I think as practitioners, there's some great viewpoints, but if we continue to add risk for that long of what we're providing today, it will affect the value of our organizations.
Mark Canant.
Yeah, a couple of quick points. Balaji, I am in the position where my money transfers go the other way, right? So from India into the US, the assumption is it's non-legit every time, right? And I have to jump through hoops. But in doing so, we have very sort of stringent KYC type policies. And so I wonder whether there's an opportunity to do something with that, in the sense that everybody is being checked, everybody's doing a KYC, know your customer check probably on an annual basis, whether or not there's an opportunity to sort of aggregate that and use the data which is held by banks and for that to become portable.
Yeah. But again, I want to go back to what Jim said, and again, I'm commenting on chat as well. Those eventualities exist in the world all the time. Like, you know, there could be a storm and your huge container ship can crash. It doesn't mean that you build a huge barricade around it every time. You buy insurance for it. Why can't we pay into some, why can't, like, you take $100 per hour, if for every transaction we pay $2 as insurance premium, potentially that something's going to break at some point in time. And imagine the $1.4 trillion that SIA calls the contingent market. Add $1 each. That's a $1.4 trillion in insurance premium that you're covering for any and all lawsuits that go in.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Balaji, a suggestion. But again, I think, wouldn't it be nice? I think it'd be fun. Let's go get a couple big insurance brokers out here and hear them comment.
Not a bad idea.
Well, I just want to thank everyone. We're kind of coming up on time. This clearly is a topic that creates some interest. So Hannah, thanks for getting us started and kind of triggering a discussion. What I would open up, if anyone's interested in getting involved in setting a standards committee, we've got a work group specifically focused on advocacy. We've got a work group specifically focused on communications. The idea of where standards are and whether we go down a path, like I think it was Sam who brought up, it was either Sam or Albert brought up the idea of the policy versus the person versus the client protection. If we want to look at that, or if we want to go down a path of looking at some things of how can we address data sharing, the net for me is it's still too complex for a worker to get onboarded with a customer. And if what we're trying to do is take the friction out of the process of connecting people with work, make it easier for companies to engage the freelance community, those are some of the barriers we want to take down. How that gets commercialized and who ends up bringing the platform together and what Web3 tools are used in here are all things that can emerge. And some of those will be competitive advantages for each of you. Clearly, we have businesses that focus on the compliance side of things, but we still have too much friction in onboarding people. And if we can reduce that, that's the opportunity. We'd love to be able to maximize, because it's when you hear the company say, it's with Barry Matthews, it was an organization who was saying, yeah, we've reduced our time to hire from 120 days down to 60 days. That's still not acceptable. Like, we want to be able to get someone on board when the work needs to be done. In a world that's becoming more agile, I need to have more flexibility. So if we have contracting processes that are 30 to 180 days long or to more than that, then we've got to improve on that. And that's, I think, where the opportunity comes up for us as a group to say, where can we attack that? So if you're interested, let Brandon or I know, and we'll bring a group together and start having a conversation. But then we'll also bring those ideas back to the community and look for something that we can all sign up to. So I'll kind of leave that part of the conversation there. I know Mark and Ashley, you guys had some things on the communications and marketing side that you guys wanted to bring up.
Ashley, do you want to take the floor?
Sure. So there's a couple of concrete initiatives that the communication work stream has been thinking about making, keeping the momentum, but also offering some fresh momentum to not only sort of amplifying our message, but also, helping to promote the individual and organizational membership for CTW. So two of those initiatives are, and Mark, I know you can speak to anything I missed, but we want to arm you all with some verbiage or some text that can make it super easy for you to share the opportunities for the CTW individual and organizational memberships that are available. We're also going to be doing a project around sort of highlighting stories from members of this group about why you joined CTW in the first place, why you stay, why you keep coming back to the calls, sort of why you're inherently excited and interested in furthering our mission. So those are two things that we're going to be working on over the next month or so. But if any of you are interested in helping us out with that, please let Mark or me know so we can make sure that you're part of that promotion and that initiative. Mark, do you want to talk about, the calls that we're trying to reinstill for the communication work stream?
Yeah, I think we're going to do it on the first Tuesday of the month, and it will be, I think, 10 a.m. Eastern time, which is probably 3:30 p.m. or 5:30 p.m. in the afternoon in the UK. 5 in the afternoon, and sometime in India. I'll circulate the times.
Very
Awesome,
good.
thank you.
John Smith/Windsor, any closing thoughts for us?
Oh man, that was such a great conversation. I love the energy and the perspective, and got so much to figure out. I love this group. So there's so much, different points of view, and so thanks for jumping in and being a part of it. And I think this is a conversation that needs to go on for a long time. Lots to figure out here. So
Sign up, become a member individually or as an organization. It's available for you now. Look forward to having more and more people engage, and to those who have, thank you. And we look forward to our calls next month.
Yeah,
Thanks all.
Hannah. Thanks for being and leading that, Hannah. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, John.
All the
Bye.
best. Take care. Ciao.
Thanks, John. Thanks, guys. Bye.